Imagine a single photograph. A 3-year-old girl in a crisp white sailor dress, dark pigtails, and a tiny gap between her front teeth. That image, captured in 1983, became the face of a mystery that would freeze time for over 4 decades. Her name was Michelle Marie Newton, Little Shelly, and on a spring morning in Louisville, she waved goodbye from her car seat, oblivious that the wave would be her last for 42 years. This isn't a story of a shadowy abduction, but a parental kidnapping that stayed cold until a single anonymous tip and the power of modern DNA brought a father's long-lost daughter back from the dead. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, we'd love for you to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support means the world and helps us bring you even more powerful stories. Stick with us until the end, and if this mystery moves you, share your thoughts in the comments and pass it along to a friend. Imagine a single photograph. It is a snapshot from early 1983, showing a 3-year-old girl in a crisp white sailor dress. She has dark hair tied into neat pigtails and a shy, innocent gap between her 2 front baby teeth. For most, it is just a vintage family relic, but for a man in Louisville, that image became the face of a mystery that would freeze his world for 42 years. Her name was Michelle Marie Newton, though everyone who loved her called her Little Shelly. On April 6, 1983, she vanished into thin air along with her mother, Deborah Lee Newton. This was not a case of a monster in a van or a stranger in the bushes. This was a parental abduction, a quiet theft of a life that stayed cold until modern science and a single anonymous phone call brought everything into a terrifyingly sharp focus. The story starts in the spring of 1983. Ronald Reagan was in the White House, and the radio was playing Flashdance on a loop. In the working-class neighborhoods of Louisville, life moved at a steady, predictable rhythm. Joseph Newton, known to his buddies as Joe, was 33 years old. He was a man who worked with his hands, a steady guy who provided for his young family. He and Deborah had been married for several years, and when Shelly arrived on October 5, 1979, she became the absolute center of his universe. Shelly was the kind of kid who was always ready with a hug, bright and curious about every ladybug she found in the grass. She loved those sailor outfits, on her collection of stuffed animals, and the view from high up on her father's shoulders during their evening walks. The Newtons were planning a massive change that year. Joe had landed a better job down in Georgia, promising warmer weather and a fresh start for the 3 of them. Deborah seemed genuinely excited about the move. She suggested heading down first to scout for apartments and get the new place ready so the transition would be easier on Shelly. On the morning of April 2, 1983, Joe watched his wife pack a suitcase and bundle their daughter into the car. Deborah kissed him goodbye and promised to call the moment they were settled. Joe remembered his daughter waving from her car seat, still wearing one of her favorite outfits, totally unaware that the wave was a final goodbye. Our Joe stayed behind to handle the sale of their house and wrap up his job. He expected a call that night, maybe a quick check-in saying they had made it safely. But the phone stayed silent. Days bled into a week. Joe tried the number Deborah had left for a potential rental in Clayton County, but there was no answer and no forwarding info. He called every friend and relative he could think of, asking if anyone had seen Deborah's car with its Kentucky plates. Nobody knew a thing. That was when the worry curdled into a cold, heavy dread. When Joe finally went to the Louisville police, they were skeptical. In the early 80s, officers often treated these disappearances as domestic spats, temporary separations where emotions just needed to cool off. But as the weeks turned into months, the investigators realized this was something different. By late spring, the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office opened a formal missing persons case. Flyers went up in truck stops and post offices across the Southeast. The description was hauntingly normal. A young mother and a toddler, last seen leaving home for a family relocation. Joe gave the detectives every scrap of info he had, even traveling to Georgia himself to knock on doors and show photos to strangers. Then came the first real blow to the gut. Sometime between late 1984 and early 1985, Deborah called Joe one last time. It was a short, tense conversation. She gave no explanation for the silence and no hint of where they were before the line went dead. After that, the trail simply evaporated. In the summer of 1985, a grand jury indicted Deborah for custodial interference. a felony in Kentucky with no statute of limitations. The FBI joined the hunt, issuing a warrant for her arrest. For a while, Deborah's face was on posters in federal buildings nationwide, listed as one of the top 8 most wanted parental kidnapping fugitives. But even that high-profile spotlight began to dim. Leads dried up. A tip would come in from Atlanta or Florida, but every time detectives checked it out, it was a dead end. As the years rolled on, forensic artists created age-progressed sketches of Shelly. They showed a girl who might have grown into a teenager with her mother's eyes and her father's smile, but the images circulated without bringing any answers. The last phone call in the winter of 1984 was the final thread anyone could hold on to. After that, the line went dead in every sense of the word. For Joe Newton, the silence was louder than any scream. Back in Louisville, the case file stayed active, but it was the kind of activity cold cases usually get. It was checked once a year, dusted off when a random tip surfaced, but otherwise left to sit in a metal cabinet. Detectives rotated in and out of the unit. They would read the thick folder, shake their heads at how ordinary the whole thing looked on paper, and then move on. There was no ransom note, no blood, and no witnesses to a struggle. Just an empty space where 2 people used to be. The search in the late 80s was exhaustive but futile. Detectives canvassed apartment complexes in Georgia, showing photos to leasing agents and checking utility records. There was no trace of a lease in Deborah's name and no electricity turned on under her identity. They expanded the search to Atlanta, Savannah, and every major city along the I-75 corridor. State troopers watched for the Kentucky plates, and the National Crime Information Center kept their names in the system as fugitives. Even a segment on America's Most Wanted and a mention in Reader's Digest failed to produce the breakthrough Joe was praying for. Tips poured in by the thousands. A woman in a Chattanooga diner, a child at an Alabama fair, a quiet family in Florida. Every false lead cost time and shattered a piece of Joe's hope. He often drove to these locations himself, sitting in his car for hours outside grocery stores, watching women walk past and hoping one of them would reveal the face he had last seen kissing their daughter goodbye. In a 1986 TV interview, Joe's voice cracked as he asked the camera, "Wouldn't you want your child back?" He kept Shelly's room exactly as it had been the day she left. The toys were on the shelf, the crib was still assembled, and a small pair of pink sneakers sat by the door, waiting for a girl who was no longer a toddler. While Joe lived in a frozen state of grief, life continued for Deborah and the child once called Shelly. Across state lines and under a new name, they built a routine and made memories. The world moved forward, but for the investigators in Louisville, the file just grew heavier with every passing decade. By the early 90s, the case slipped from the headlines. The FBI removed Deborah from the top list, and the spotlight moved on to newer, more violent crimes. Joe never remarried. He stayed in that house, a quiet man who just wanted to know if his daughter was safe. Then came the procedural blows that almost ended the search for good. In 2000, the local prosecutor dismissed the original indictment. It was a technicality. They couldn't find Joe to testify because he had moved for work and hadn't updated his contact info with the court. 5 years later, Michelle's name vanished from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's active database. Their policy allowed cases to be archived if there were no leads and no evidence of foul play. Shelly was no longer an active missing child. The system presumed she was either safe under a new identity or dead. Joe was devastated when he found out, telling a relative they took her off the list like she never even existed. But the years ground on, and cold case units continued their annual audits. They ran Deborah's name through new databases, e-credit reports, and driver's license records, but every search came back blank. Then, in late 2015, a small crack appeared. A distant relative of Deborah's reached out to the sheriff's office after seeing a news segment about a different parental abduction. She remembered Deborah saying once that if she ever had to disappear, she'd go somewhere warm with palm trees like Florida. It was a thin lead, but it was enough for Detective Mark Harlan to reopen the physical file. Harlan was a veteran investigator who didn't expect miracles, but he believed every case deserved a fresh set of eyes. He re-interviewed Joe, who was now in his late 60s. Joe was grayer and quieter, But his story hadn't changed by a single word. Harland had the custodial interference warrant reissued in 2016, officially reviving the hunt. Yeah, he started running Deborah's info through modern digital tools, cross-referencing old tips with facial recognition software. He sent queries to Florida authorities, looking for any woman in her late 50s living under an alias that might fit. The breakthrough came when genetic genealogy began to explode. In 2018, high-profile arrests showed that law enforcement could use public DNA databases to find people who didn't want to be found. Harlan realized that while he had no crime scene DNA, he had a living relative, Deborah's sister, Lisa, who still lived in Louisville. If they ever found a suspect, they could use Lisa's DNA to confirm the match. It was a long shot that finally paid off in the spring of 2025. An anonymous tip landed on Harlan's desk on a humid Tuesday in early May. A woman calling Crime Stoppers said she had been reading about old cases and noticed something uncanny. She looked at the age-progressed photo of Deborah and then looked at a woman in her community called Sharon Neely. Sharon lived in the Villages, a massive retirement community in Florida. She was a quiet lady who kept to herself, but the caller insisted the resemblance was too strong to ignore. Harlan listened to the recording and felt something different about this tip. It wasn't vague or hysterical. It named a real place and a real alias. He pulled up the photos, laying the 1983 snapshot next to the 2010 age progression. Then he checked the property records for Sharon Neely. The villa had been purchased in 2011. Sharon's birth date was listed as October 1960, which was suspiciously close to Deborah's actual birth in July 1959. Harlan contacted a detective in Florida, Carla Ruiz, and asked her to discreetly get a recent photo of Sharon. Ruiz found a picture from a 4th of July neighborhood picnic on Facebook. When Harlan sent the image to a forensic specialist, the software returned a 92% similarity score. It was enough to justify a trip to Florida. Harlan and Ruiz spent 3 days on surveillance in the Villages. On a Friday morning, Sharon stepped out to walk her dog. When Harlan saw her through a long lens, the resemblance to the 1983 original was no longer subtle. He saw the shape of the cheekbones and the way she carried her head. He felt that familiar tightening in his chest. The case was no longer theoretical. He went back to Louisville and met Lisa at her kitchen table. Lisa didn't hesitate to provide a DNA sample, telling Harlan she had been waiting for this day for 40 years. A Florida judge signed a warrant for Sharon's DNA in June 2025. When a detective knocked on her door, Sharon didn't fight. She simply said, "I figured this day would come eventually." The samples were rushed to the lab in Kentucky. On July 11th, the report confirmed what Joe had never stopped believing. The woman in Florida was Deborah Lee Newton, and the probability of the match was 99.9997%. Harlan called Joe that afternoon. When he told him they had found her and that Shelly was alive, there was a long silence on the line. Joe finally repeated the words twice, testing them for reality. After 4 decades of waiting, the ghost of 1983 was finally coming home. The moment Detective Harlan hung up the phone with Joe, the mechanical gears of the justice system began to grind with a new, frantic energy. For 42 years, this case had been a ghost story whispered in the halls of the precinct, but now, it was a logistical puzzle that needed solving. Harlan spent the next several days hunkered down with social workers from the Florida Department of Children and Families. Even though the little girl in the sailor dress was now a 46-year-old woman, the psychological weight of this revelation required a delicate touch. They needed to find her current identity without tipping off the woman known as Sharon Neely. They located her in Ocala, just a short drive from the manicured lawns of the retirement community where her mother had hidden in plain sight. She was living under the name Alexis Marie Carter, a name she had used since she was a teenager. On her life was the picture of quiet stability. She worked as a veterinary technician, spent her weekends volunteering at local shelters, and lived in a small apartment filled with photos of the dogs she had helped save. To her neighbors, she was just Alexis, a private but kind woman who was exceptionally good with animals. She had never married and had no children of her own, living a life that was unremarkable, except for the massive, invisible hole where her past should have been. While the paperwork for the arrest was being finalized, Detective Harlan sat in his office, staring at Alexis's social media profile. He saw a woman with his friend Joe's eyes, a woman who had grown up believing her father was a dead man. The injustice of it felt heavy in the room. Deborah hadn't just stolen a child. She had stolen 40 years of birthdays, on holidays and memories from a man who had done nothing but love them. Harlan checked his watch. It was almost time. The arrest was scheduled for Monday, November 24th, 2025, the Monday before Thanksgiving. It was a cool, clear morning in the Villages. The air smelled like freshly cut grass and the faint, citrusy scent of blooming hedges. Retirees were already out on their golf carts, humming along the paths in a slow, rhythmic parade toward the morning's activities. At 9:42 a.m., Sharon Neely stepped out of her front door. She was dressed for a day of mundane errands: a light blue cardigan, khaki capris, and white sneakers. She carried a small canvas tote bag, likely containing the holiday card she intended to mail at the post office. She never made it to the end of her driveway. Two unmarked cars had been idling at the end of the cul-de-sac since dawn. As she walked, a uniformed deputy named Travis Cole stepped out of the lead vehicle. He kept his hands visible, his voice low and professional as he asked if she was Sharon Neely. Sharon stopped. The tote bag dangled motionless at her side. She looked at the deputy, then at the second car where Harlan sat watching through the windshield. "Yes," she said, her voice eerily steady. When Cole informed her of the warrant from Kentucky for custodial interference, her composure didn't shatter, it just cracked slightly at the edges. A neighbor across the street, watering his hibiscus bushes, called out a confused joke about them finally coming for her. Sharon didn't look at him. She let the deputy place her hands behind her back. The cuffs clicked softly in the morning quiet. As she was led toward the car, the body camera caught her whispering a single, haunting sentence. "I never meant for it to go on this long." With Sharon in custody, the most volatile part of the operation began: the notification of Alexis. Elena Morales, a civilian liaison trained in trauma-informed care, was chosen to deliver the news. She knocked on Alexis's door at 11:15 a.m. Alexis answered in her work scrubs, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. She looked confused as Elena and a deputy asked to come inside. The living room was small and cozy, half decorated for Christmas. Elena sat on the edge of the couch and got straight to the point. She told Alexis that the woman she knew as her mother was actually Deborah Lee Newton. She told her she had been born Michelle Marie Newton in Louisville, Kentucky, and that she had been missing since 1983. Alexis's face went completely blank. Her breathing became short and shallow, a physical reaction to her world collapsing in real time. "That's not possible," Alexis whispered. She explained that her mother had always told her father died when she was a baby, and that they had moved to escape his family. Elena didn't argue. She just reached into a folder and laid out 3 photographs on the coffee table. On the left was the toddler in the sailor dress. In the middle was the age-progressed sketch from 2010. On the right was Alexis's own driver's license photo. Alexis stared at the images. Her hand moved slowly, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the photo of the little girl with the gap-toothed smile. When she touched the paper, she flinched as if the image were hot to the touch. Elena gently explained the DNA match with her Aunt Lisa and told her that her biological father, Joseph Newton, was still alive. He had been looking for her for every single one of those 42 years. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Alexis didn't cry immediately. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, looking like someone who was trying to memorize a language she had forgotten she knew. After a long silence, she looked up and asked the only question that mattered. "Does he know?" Elena nodded. Then Alexis asked the second, "Can I meet him?" Back in Louisville, Joe Newton was sitting in his living room, staring at the phone. When Harlan called to tell him that his daughter wanted to see him, Joe's voice was a ragged whisper. "When?" he asked. Harlan told him as soon as she was ready. Joe stood up and walked into the bedroom that had been frozen in 1983. He began to clean. He didn't want to change anything, but he wanted it to be perfect. He dusted the stuffed animals and put fresh sheets on the bed, his movements slow and deliberate. For Alexis, the next 48 hours were a blur of shock and fragmented memories. She couldn't sleep. She just sat in her living room, staring at the photographs spread out on her table. She realized that every holiday, every birthday, and every fact about her life had been built on a foundation of air. She had been raised by a woman she loved, but that woman was also her kidnapper. Even the psychological tension was unbearable. The first contact was arranged for Wednesday afternoon, the day before Thanksgiving. It was a phone call, bridged by Elena and Detective Harland. Two speakerphones, 2,000 miles apart. When Joe answered, his heart was hammering against his ribs. There was a long pause, and then a woman's voice, soft, uncertain, and sounding hauntingly like Deborah's, came through the line. "Hi, this is Michelle." Joe's breath hitched. He had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his head, but all the rehearsals vanished in the heat of the reality. "Michelle," he said, the name sounding like a prayer he was finally allowed to say out loud. They talked for 47 minutes. They didn't talk about the kidnapping or the crime. They talked about dogs and the oak tree in the front yard that was still standing. Michelle learned that she had a room waiting for her, and she laughed a small wet sound when Joe mentioned the stuffed animals were probably a little dusty. When the call ended, both of them were drained, their faces wet with tears they hadn't expected to shed. The injustice of the lost time was still there, but for the first time in 42 years, the silence had been broken. The plan was set. Michelle was flying to Louisville on Thanksgiving Day. She was going home to a man she didn't know, to a life she didn't remember, and to a past that was finally, after 4 decades, ready to be reclaimed. The overcast sky above Louisville on Thanksgiving Day, November 27, 2025, felt heavy, as if the clouds themselves were holding their breath. Yet Joe Newton woke up before the sun, moving through his kitchen with a quiet, practiced rhythm. He prepared the same meal he had cooked in solitude for 42 years: turkey, stuffing, and sweet potato pie. But this morning, the air in the house didn't feel quite so stale. For the first time in 4 decades, Joe pulled a second plate from the cupboard and set it at the table, not out of a desperate hope, but out of a concrete certainty. Michelle arrived at the airport that afternoon, requesting total privacy to avoid the media circus that was already beginning to swirl around the case. Detective Harland and Elena Morales met her at the terminal and drove her through the streets of a city she hadn't seen since she was 3 years old. They parked a block away from the house, allowing her to walk the final stretch alone. She stood on the sidewalk for a full minute, her eyes tracing the roofline of the modest home. She had no conscious memory of the place, yet as she climbed the 3 wooden steps to the porch and knocked, her hand didn't tremble. When the door opened, time seemed to collapse. Joe saw the dark hair and the gentle eyes of the toddler he had lost in 1983. Michelle saw an older man with tired lines around his mouth, but he wore the same soft smile she had seen in the photographs Elena had shown her. Neither of them spoke at first. They simply looked at each other until Joe reached out slowly, and Michelle stepped into a hug that felt like a bridge crossing 42 years of silence. Joe whispered into her hair that she was finally home. Michelle's reply was a quiet revelation. She hadn't even known she was missing, or they spent the rest of the day in the living room, surrounded by the photo albums Joe had kept safe like sacred relics. Michelle spoke of her life in Florida, her job at the animal clinic, and the quiet routines she had built. She spoke of the woman she knew as Sharon without anger, only a profound, echoing confusion. "She was just my mom," she explained softly. Joe didn't press for details or demand she take a side. He just sat there and listened to the sound of a voice he thought he would never hear again. The following morning, the reality of the situation shifted from the emotional to the judicial. Michelle and Joe sat side by side in the gallery of the Jefferson County Circuit Court for Deborah's arraignment. Deborah appeared via a video feed from the jail in Florida, wearing a bright orange jumpsuit, her face an unreadable mask. When the judge read the charge of custodial interference, Deborah entered a plea of not guilty. In a moment that silenced the room, Deborah looked up and finally saw her daughter and husband sitting together. Her eyes widened, and she stared for several long seconds before the video feed cut to black. Outside the courthouse, Michelle gave a brief, prepared statement to the reporters. She told them it was a complicated situation, that she loved the woman who raised her, but she was also getting to know the father she had lost. She wasn't choosing sides, She was just trying to understand how her entire history could be an omission. Sheriff Mike Davis held his own press conference later that week, praising Detective Harlan's persistence and the breakthrough of genetic technology that had turned a cold trail into a homecoming. Or in the months that followed, Michelle began the grueling work of rebuilding two lives at once. She visited Louisville frequently, taking walks in the park with Joe and eating at the same diner he used to take her to when she was a baby. She kept her job in Florida, but started the legal process of changing her name to Michelle Marie Newton Carter, a bridge between the identity she was given and the one that was stolen. She even began taking guarded phone calls from Deborah, looking for the answers that only her mother could provide. As of early 2026, the criminal case remains pending while the family navigates the wreckage of the past. The little girl in the sailor dress is no longer just a face on a yellowed flyer. She is a woman in her 40s with a complicated history and a father who finally got to see her grow up. He is somewhere in Louisville, on a quiet mantle. That 1983 photograph still smiles, but the smile finally belongs to someone who is home. If this journey through the decades of a frozen mystery touched you, don't let the story end here. There are thousands of other families still waiting for their breakthrough, staring at photographs and hoping for a miracle. Consider supporting the channel. Hit the like button, subscribe, and join our community as we continue to revisit the cases that time almost forgot and celebrate the extraordinary power of the human spirit. Your engagement helps keep these stories alive and reminds the world that a trail may go cold, but it never truly disappears. Disclaimer: the following program is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only. While this script is modeled after the documented disappearance and recovery of Michelle Newton, including specific details regarding the 1983 Louisville abduction, the cold case investigation, and the 2025 DNA breakthrough, certain narrative elements, micro-movements, and dialogue have been dramatized for storytelling impact. This content is not a substitute for professional legal or investigative advice. If you have information regarding an active missing persons case, please contact your local law enforcement agency or the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children immediately.